The limitations of the Articles of Confederation ultimately led to the creation of what is now our U.S. Constitution. The Constitution was drafted during the Constitutional Convention of 1787 in Philadelphia and then sent to the states for ratification. In 1788, Massachusetts leaders met at Long Lane Meeting House, also a church, in downtown Boston, to debate whether to ratify the Constitution. Today, there is a large office building at that location, the next stop on our walking tour. Not surprisingly, Massachusetts' ratification process was contentious, but they ultimately voted to ratify the Constitution, and it went into effect in 1789.
So all of that was put together, passed in the Constitutional Convention in late 1787. Then it in turn went to the states. The new Constitution would not come into effect until 9 states approved of that new Constitution. The first approval came from Delaware, which was a unanimous passage. They actually started their convention after Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had hoped to be first, started their delegation first, but it got sufficiently contentious that Delaware was able to very quickly pass them and become, their motto is now, the first state. Pennsylvania was second, and it went so on and so forth, many of the early conventions passing either unanimously or with little objection, until we get to Massachusetts. Massachusetts was the first of the many contentious conventions to approve the Constitution. Massachusetts argued each clause in detail, in specific, in front of over 300 delegates. So over the course of about a month, they argued out each and every detail of the Constitution itself, clause by clause, section by section, and ultimately passed, but only by 19 votes, approved of the Constitution and simultaneously sent numerous changes, many of which are now enshrined as amendments to the U.S. Constitution, largely as the Bill of Rights, and became the 6th state to approve the Constitution. Several months later, the 9th state approved, and those 9 states became the United States of America, all bound by the Constitution.
The Constitution is a series of compromises of power that reflect the concerns of the colonists about a centralized government or king on one hand, and the need for a centralized government to regulate commerce, levy taxes, and negotiate with other governments on the other hand. The compromises create a federal system where there is a federal government with enumerated powers, and all the remaining powers are left to the states. This means that the federal government's power is limited to what the Constitution actually states it can do. These powers include to collect taxes, print and borrow money, issue patents and copyrights, control immigration, have a postal service, regulate interstate highways, negotiate with other governments, and of course have armed forces. Then, in what is referred to as the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, the federal government was given the power to regulate interstate commerce. This also meant, under what is called the Dormant Commerce Clause, that states could not interfere with interstate commerce.
The Congress, or the federal government, was given absolute control of commerce in the United States. And with subsequent judicial interpretation of the Commerce Clause, the states may not in any way interfere with commerce without express leave from Congress, because the commerce problems were so bad under the Articles of Confederation that this was a reaction. There will be no state interference with commerce.
Outside of the enumerated powers, including the Commerce Clause, all other powers are left to the states. The Constitution also included the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause says that when there is a conflict between state and federal laws, the federal law is supreme, meaning it always trumps state law in the event of a conflict. A good example of the Supremacy Clause right in Boston is the Customs House.
Behind us is one of Boston's most iconic landmarks, the Customs House Tower. It was built in the early 1900s and stands almost 150 meters tall. no time in Boston's history has a building that tall been allowed under Boston's zoning. However, the Customs House was a federal building. It initially was only 2 stories tall with a good dome on it, but Boston's port traffic was such that they needed a bigger Customs House, and the federal government decided to build up. Boston could not do anything about it because of the supremacy clause in the federal Constitution, which says that federal law is the supreme law of the land, except for the federal Constitution. So state law and even state constitutions fall before federal law. And in this case, the federal government had been given the authority, had given it, the Customs House the authority to build a tall building. Boston could do nothing about it.
The Constitution also created a balance of power within the federal government. It creates 3 branches of the federal government: judiciary, legislative, and executive. The judicial branch's role is to interpret and apply the law. The Constitution created the U.S. Supreme Court and a federal court system. Federal judges, including Supreme Court justices, are nominated by the President, approved by the Senate, and have a job for life. The lifetime tenure reflects a desire to keep the judiciary independent of the other 2 branches of government. By interpreting and applying the law, the judiciary creates an important element of our legal system: common law. Common law is case law made by judges that is binding on cases that come thereafter under a concept referred to as stare decisis. Stare decisis means let the decision stand in Latin. The legislative branch makes the laws through passing statutes. The legislative branch was divided into 2 houses in the Constitution: the House of Representatives and the Senate. The citizens of their states elect the representatives and senators. The executive branch enforces the law. The best known part of the executive is the president, of course, but there are many other important parts of the executive branch, including administrative agencies, such as the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Federal Trade Commission.